T is the night of September 14th, 1940. Somewhere in the flat darkness south of Bristol, a man named Colonel John Turner strikes a match. Around him, across several acres of harvested farmland, dozens of workers crouch in shallow trenches and behind low earthen berms, their faces turned upward toward a sky already flickering with the distant anti-aircraft fire of the city's defenses. They are not soldiers, not exactly. They are painters and electricians, theater lighting men and film set builders. And in a few moments, they are about to attempt something that has never been tried at this scale in the history of warfare. Turner gives the signal, and the field begins to burn. Not with real fire. Not at first. Specially designed electrical braziers ignite in careful sequence. Strings of dim, amber-tinted lights flicker on across the perimeter, mimicking the scattered glow of incendiary bombs already doing their work on a stricken city. A petrol tank, jury-rigged with a timer and a low-pressure valve, belches a controlled gust of flame perhaps 4 meters into the night sky, convincing at altitude, devastating in effect. The smell of burning coal and scorched earth rises into the cold autumn air, and somewhere high above the clouds, the navigators of an inbound Heinkel He 111 bomber, already stressed and disorientated after 300 kilometers of night flying over the channel, make a decision. Their target, they believe, is burning. The fires are exactly where their intelligence maps said they would be. They release their payload on the field. 47 high-explosive bombs and dozens of incendiaries crater a stretch of Somerset farmland. Not a single civilian is killed. Not a single factory is damaged. The cows in the adjoining pasture survive with what one local Home Guard report tactfully described as considerable agitation. Britain has just weaponized the art of the fake, and in doing so, has begun one of the most audacious and least celebrated deception campaigns of the Second World War. The program has a modest bureaucratic title, Colonel Turner's Department, later formalized as Directorate of Works, but it will come to be known by those few cleared to discuss it as the Starfish Program. And over the next 4 years, it will fool the Luftwaffe not once, not a dozen times, but on hundreds of documented occasions, drawing bombers away from Britain's most vital industrial cities and directing their munitions into open fields, marshes, and empty coastline. This is the story of how Britain built fake cities, burned them on purpose, and tricked the most technologically advanced air force in the world into bombing nothing. To understand why Starfish existed, you have to understand the problem it was designed to solve, and that problem was, in the autumn of 1940, almost unsolvable. The German Luftwaffe had developed a suite of radio navigation systems, Nicobine, and later X-Jurate and Y-Jurate, which allowed their bomber crews to fly in near total darkness and still locate targets with alarming precision. These were not blunt instruments. The beams could direct a bomber stream to within a few hundred meters of a specific building at distances of several hundred kilometers. For a nation defending cities like Coventry, Birmingham, Southampton, Liverpool, and Bristol, cities packed with factories, rail yards, docks, and hundreds of thousands of people, the maths were terrifying. The RAF's night fighters in 1940 were bluntly outmatched. The Bristol Blenheim, pressed into night fighter service, had a top speed of roughly 460 kilometers per hour, and its early airborne radar was unreliable, temperamental, and dependent on ground control stations that were themselves overwhelmed. Anti-aircraft guns could put shrapnel into the sky in impressive quantities, but at the altitudes the Luftwaffe preferred, between 3,000 and 6,000 meters, accurate fire in darkness required a miracle of coordination that Britain could not yet reliably perform. The German bomber crews knew this. They flew in loose formations at night, often quite slowly, taking their time over targets because there was, in the early months of the Blitz, very little to rush away from. The British authorities calculated that in the raid on Coventry alone, on the night of November 14, 1940, over 500 German aircraft dropped approximately 500 tons of high explosive and nearly 900 incendiary containers over the city. The cathedral was gutted. 12 armament factories were severely damaged. Over 4,000 homes were destroyed. Approximately 568 civilians were killed. The city's industrial output, critical to Spitfire and Lancaster production, was crippled for months. Coventry was not unusual. It was simply the most dramatic single example of what happened when Britain had no answer to a bomber stream that knew exactly where it was going. The passive defenses, dispersal of factories, underground shelters, blackout regulations, helped, but they could not stop bombs from falling. What was needed was not a way to harden the targets, but a way to move them. If the Luftwaffe could not be prevented from finding a fire, Britain had to give them a different fire to find. The man who understood this most clearly was Colonel John Fisher Turner, a former officer of the Royal Engineers with a background in large-scale infrastructure and a particular affinity for problems that conventional military thinking had declared impossible. Turner had been given his brief in mid-1940 by the Air Ministry with characteristic understatement: deceive the German bomber force. The resources available to him were slim, the timescale was urgent, and the science of large-scale pyrotechnic deception had, to put it plainly, never been seriously attempted by anyone. Turner assembled a team at a requisitioned facility in Shepperton, Surrey, the same studios where British film industry craftsmen had spent decades perfecting the illusion of reality on screen. The choice was deliberate. What Turner needed were people who understood light, shadow, perspective, and the psychology of the observer. He needed people who could make something look convincing from 3,000 meters at night, moving at 300 kilometers per hour. He found them among set painters, lighting riggers, theatrical electricians, and the kind of quietly brilliant practical engineers that Britain has always produced in quiet abundance. The central technical challenge was this: a burning city seen from altitude at night is a specific and identifiable pattern of light and heat. There are large fire sources, warehouses, fuel depots, rail yards catching, and smaller scattered sources, the incendiaries seeding individual streets. There is a characteristic bloom of heat, a haze of smoke that reflects the firelight upward. The early starfish sites, the QF sites as they were designated, attempted to replicate this using a combination of electrical braziers, petrol-fueled fire baskets, and controlled oil burns, all arranged across fields of 4 to 8 hectares and triggered in sequence to match the progression of a real incendiary attack. The braziers themselves were ingenious. Each unit consisted of a metal basket roughly 60 centimeters in diameter, filled with coal and soaked wood, suspended above a small petrol reservoir connected by pipe to a central control. A single operator could ignite dozens of them simultaneously from a buried command point, and by varying the fuel mixture, could control the color and intensity of the light output. Burning coal produces a yellowish-orange glow similar to a timber fire. Adding specific quantities of oil gave a redder, longer-burning flame that closely mimicked the early stages of an incendiary attack on industrial buildings. The larger J-type fires, the simulated conflagrations that represented burning fuel or industrial sites, used a different approach. Petrol was pumped under pressure through a perforated pipe and ignited at the nozzle, creating a roaring column of flame up to 8 meters tall. The sound was significant, a deep, resonant rushing that carried for several kilometers, and the heat output was sufficient that the fire baskets had to be positioned at least 30 meters away to prevent them being extinguished by the turbulence. Later iterations, designated QF Mark II and Mark III, incorporated what the engineers called shimmer panels, thin metal sheets suspended on wires above the fire baskets, which caught the heat updraft and flickered in a pattern that, from altitude, closely resembled the scattered light of a burning residential district. The whole assembly for a full starfish site, including the underground fuel tanks, control bunkers, cable runs, and fire basket positions, could be built by a team of 30 men in approximately 3 weeks, at a cost the Air Ministry assessed as negligible compared to the replacement value of a single aircraft factory. By mid-1941, over 200 starfish sites had been constructed across the United Kingdom, each one positioned between 2 and 20 kilometers from a genuine high-value target in the direction from which German approach paths were most likely to originate. The operational record of the starfish sites is, by the standards of wartime deception, extraordinary and in many cases meticulously documented. On the night of December 2, 1940, a starfish site southwest of Bristol designated SF Bristol 2 was activated as German bombers approached the city along their usual southwesterly track. According to records held at the National Archives, the site drew a significant portion of the raiding force off target, with over 100 high-explosive bombs and approximately 2,000 incendiaries falling on open ground near the village of Long Ashton. Bristol itself was struck, but the dock area, the primary target, suffered considerably less damage than German post-raid analysis suggested should have occurred. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The site operators lived, it must be said, in conditions of considerable danger. They worked in shallow command bunkers while the sky above them was filled with Luftwaffe bombers whose crews were, from the German perspective, doing precisely the right thing, saturating a burning target with follow-on munitions. The operators were not soldiers in any formal sense. They wore no special armor. Their bunkers were sufficient to survive a near miss, but not a direct hit. The standard operating procedure, recorded in Turner's departmental files, instructed operators to remain at their stations until the attacking force had departed, activating additional fire baskets as needed to maintain the deception through the duration of the raid. Several operators were killed or wounded in the course of the program. Their names do not appear in the standard histories of the Battle of Britain or the Blitz. They existed, officially, within a program that was itself classified, doing work that Britain declined to publicize both during and after the war, for reasons that remain partly technical. The techniques developed were considered too useful to compromise, and partly the quiet British reluctance to celebrate cleverness that worked precisely because no one noticed it. The site at Aberporth in Wales successfully diverted raids intended for the Bristol Aeroplane Company's manufacturing complex at Filton on at least 3 occasions. A site near Derby drew bombers away from the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine works, the same works producing the engines for the Spitfire and the Hurricane, on 2 separate nights in early 1941. The psychological dimension of these diversions is difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. Every bomb that fell on a Somerset field or a Welsh hillside was a bomb that did not destroy a machine tool, a jig, a trained worker, or a finished aircraft. Germany was not, it must be said, without its own deception capabilities. The Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe had used decoy airfields in Poland and France, and the Kriegsmarine had experimented with dummy harbor installations in Norway. But German decoy doctrine was fundamentally passive. The aim was concealment, hiding the real thing beneath camouflage rather than actively drawing the enemy toward a false one. The British starfish approach was fundamentally different in its psychology. It did not ask the enemy to miss. It gave the enemy something convincing to hit. The American approach to target deception, developed somewhat later in the war, tended toward elaborate static camouflage, painting runways to resemble fields from altitude, constructing inflatable dummy tanks and aircraft. These were effective but expensive, and they depended on the enemy failing to notice they were fake. The starfish sites depended on nothing so fragile as enemy oversight. They demanded only that the enemy see a fire and, quite reasonably, decide to bomb it. The German response to the decoys, when they eventually suspected their existence, was characteristically systematic and ultimately insufficient. Luftwaffe navigators were instructed to verify target identification against multiple reference points before bomb release. Some crews, encountering the starfish fires, held back to assess them before committing their loads. A handful of post-raid intelligence reports recovered after the war show German analysts noting the suspiciously convenient location of certain fires, positioned as if to draw attention, one report from Luftflotte 3 observed. But the navigational realities of night bombing, with its inherent uncertainties and the constant threat of anti-aircraft fire and fighters, meant that doubt, even when present, rarely translated into restraint. A burning target was a burning target, and fuel was finite. The Soviets, briefed on the basic concept through intelligence channels in 1942, developed their own version of the Decoy fire program for the defense of Moscow and Leningrad, though their implementation was cruder and their documentation considerably sparser. Assessing the actual strategic impact of the Starfish program with precision is, honest historians must acknowledge, genuinely difficult. The classified nature of the sites meant that post-raid analysis was itself filtered through deception considerations. Records of successful diversions were kept separately from standard Luftwaffe raid reports, and the cross-referencing required to establish a definitive diversion count was never systematically undertaken during the war itself. What can be said with confidence is this. A 1941 Air Ministry internal review, declassified in the 1990s and held at Kew, assessed that Starfish sites had attracted enemy bomb loads on at least 115 nights of the Blitz and subsequent German night offensive, diverting an estimated 3,000 tons of high explosive from urban and industrial targets. If that figure is even approximately correct, the cost-benefit calculation is staggering. The entire Starfish program, including construction, operation, fuel, and staffing across all 230 sites, cost less than the replacement value of a single medium bomber factory. The program's influence on subsequent British deception doctrine was deep and lasting. The techniques developed by Turner's team, the understanding of pyrotechnic signature management, the psychology of the observer under stress, the principle of giving the enemy something active to engage rather than passive to discover, fed directly into the Special Operations Executive's camouflage and deception training, and from there into the planning for Operation Bodyguard, the vast deception operation that preceded D-Day in 1944. Several Starfish control bunkers survive today. A particularly well-preserved example can be found near the village of Herne in Dorset, its concrete walls still bearing the bracket mounts for fire control cables, its entrance tunnel still showing the blast deflection wall that was standard Turner specification. It sits in a field that, to any passing eye, is simply a field, which is, in a sense, precisely the point. Return, for a moment, to that Somerset field on the night of September 14, 1940. The bombers have passed. Their engines fade northward, back toward the French coast and the debriefing rooms of Luftwaffe 3. The last of the J-type fires gutters down to a smolder. The operators emerge from their bunkers, check the perimeter for unexploded ordnance, and telephone their report to Turner's office. 47 high-explosive bombs, dozens of incendiaries, a field pitted with craters, steaming gently in the cool night air. Not a child dead, not a machine tool lost, not a single wall of the Bristol factories cracked. Over the next 4 years, that pattern would repeat itself hundreds of times across the length and breadth of Britain, in Dorset and Devon, in Kent and Norfolk, in the flat Midlands countryside surrounding the great industrial cities that Hitler needed to destroy and could not. The Luftwaffe flew with extraordinary technical sophistication. They had navigation systems of genuine brilliance. Their bomber crews were experienced, courageous, and ruthlessly trained. And Britain, with paraffin drums and electrical cable and the professional ingenuity of a handful of theater electricians, sent them home having bombed a field. There is a school of thought in military history that the great victories of the Second World War were won by the large things, the factories and the convoys, the bombing campaigns and the tank armies and the beach landings. And this is true. But it is also true that wars are full of moments when the decisive element is not the largest or the loudest, but the cleverest, when the vital contribution is made not by the man with the most powerful weapon, but by the man with the most convincing fake. Colonel Turner was never awarded a Victoria Cross. His name does not appear on any war memorial. The operators who crouched in their bunkers while the Luftwaffe's payload fell around them, Those painters and electricians and lighting riggers who had turned a professional understanding of illusion into a form of national defense received no campaign medals specific to their service. The program they operated remained classified for decades after the war ended, long after the men and women who staffed it had returned, quietly to civilian life. But consider what they achieved. Consider the factories that kept running, the workers who went home, the aircraft that got built, the raids that were absorbed by nothing more than fire and wire and a field. Britain did not win the Blitz by being stronger than Germany. It did not win by being louder or faster or more heavily armed. It won, in part, by being stranger, by responding to the most technologically sophisticated air assault in history with something that would not have looked out of place on a film set. By understanding that the most powerful weapon in a bombing campaign is not the bomb, but the eye of the man deciding where to aim it. The Luftwaffe bombed British fields for 4 years, and Britain burned them deliberately, every single time, and called it victory. Because it was.